Well, welcome everybody, those from Abingdon, those from far afield and further afield and very far away. You're all very, very welcome to this meeting that is, I feel, a really important one. It's very close to Holocaust Memorial Day, and the UK ceremony for Holocaust Memorial Day this year will be streamed online on Thursday, the 27th of January at 7 p.m. And you have to register at HMD, Holocaust Memorial Day, hmd.org.uk. But it seemed very appropriate that we have the two speakers tonight, Daniel, who is local to Abingdon and a member of Abingdon Peace Group and well known to many of us. And also a very warm welcome to Rebecca Tinsley, who's a very widely respected journalist and a human rights activist. She was a former BBC politics reporter, and she's worked in 9 African countries. And she founded Waging for Peace and also Network for Africa, which helps survivors of genocide to rebuild their lives. She's also a novelist, and her third novel, When the Stars Fall to Earth, is based on interviews with survivors of the genocide in Darfur. And I have a copy and I've read it, and it's a very, very, very good read. Now, when she came to Abingdon Peace Group some years ago, she alerted us then, as she said, to the then looming situation in Cameroon, and we have since then, as a group and as individuals, tried to raise awareness and action in connection with the tragic situation there, and will continue to do that. She was also the inspiration for the exhibition of artwork by children caught in conflict situations, which Abingdon Peace Group put on, organised, liaising with all the local schools, as a result of the inspiration that she'd given us on her first visit to Abingdon to speak to a meeting of the Abingdon Peace Group. The format tonight will be Daniel. We will listen with great interest to your presentation, and there'll be just a few minutes after you speak for any immediate questions before we turn to Rosemary, and then at the end there'll be a time for questions to either or both of the two speakers, if that's okay with everyone. But Daniel, the floor is yours. We await you.
Thank you very much. I was going to say Peter, because that's what comes on the screen.
Oh gosh, yes, sorry.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with a quote. It's the heading to my father's obituary in The Guardian in September 2003. He was described as the writer and keeper of memory who devoted his life to the grim tragedies of the Holocaust and to mending bridges between Jews and Poles. He was born in Krakow in 1913 to a Jewish middle-class but not very religious family, and as a young man became a campaigning Zionist, a follower of Vladimir Jabotinsky, and assuming his adult life would be spent in Palestine. Another young Jew of his generation, writing and speaking in Krakow, but of a different Zionist persuasion, was Menachem Begin. They went very different ways, but met up in Israel in the 70s, when Begin turned on my father, calling him an effing tourist. That hurt. He always claimed that meeting my mother in 1940 and marrying in 1944 put an end to his ambition to go to Palestine. But she, when he died, said that was not true, as she would have gone with him. However, there was more truth in his other reason, that it would not have ended well. He was not a pacifist and thought that setting up the State of Israel was the greatest achievement of the 20th century. But in retrospect, his politics would not have aligned with the majority views that have mostly prevailed since the founding of the state. Going back to 1938, a friend of the family persuaded his parents that it was not safe to stay in Poland, and Raphael, which is his name, was allowed to depart for England until it was safe to return. He worked for a while with Ignacy Schwarzbart, one of the two Jewish representatives to the Polish government in exile in London. He was with him when the telegram from the Polish underground arrived with the first news of death camps. Schwarzbart that day recorded in his diary, "This is not possible." Raphael spent the rest of his life trying to explicate the impossible. "The greatest difficulty, as I see it," he wrote, "is how to present the boundless horror of those events which have no analogy in history, and at the same time not to undermine the belief in the sense of creation, in human values, and in justice." He was also with Schwarzbart when the BBC broke the news to the Jews still in Poland that they were no longer alone and that Britain has declared war on Germany. Those who've seen the film The Pianist will have seen a Jewish family listening to the radio, and my father was employed by the filmmaker to relay that message, but in English in his very heavy Eastern European accent rather than the original Polish. He was not a survivor in the sense that he was never incarcerated, and he had lost a whole of extended family of Scharfs, but he had lost the whole extended family of Scharfs. The exception was his mother, who had good looks, that is not readily being identifiable as Jewish, was a woman, not having the evidence of Jewishness in her underpants, and was very resourceful. My father was in Norway interrogating German prisoners of war, but when the news of her survival reached him, he was given a Land Rover and a driver, found her in Warsaw, and arranged for her transference to England. However, he was driven by a survivor's guilt that can be very powerful, those experiencing a near miss. He wrote, "How does one cope with the knowledge that almost everybody one knew, family, friends, teachers, neighbours, shopkeepers, beggars, all died some horrible death, and it is only due to some accidental twist of fate that one has not gone the same way?" The Intelligence Corps in the British Army employed a number of German and German-speaking Poles. He worked in the London Cage, where his commanding officer, Colonel Scotland, is suspected of inventing and deploying the enhanced interrogation techniques that later emerged in Northern Ireland. My father said he had suspicions, but no knowledge. He has a story of being given the job of interviewing Field Marshal Kesselring to find out whether the German High Command had known that security codes had been broken, i.e. by Bletchley Park, and was convinced that they had not. Kesselring is infamous for killing 10 civilians for every Jewish officer or soldier killed in Italy. In Kesselring's biography, he recalls being interviewed by a young Jewish officer and giving him advice that there will be a bright future for the Jews, but only if they exercise forgiveness and don't seek revenge against the Germans. Then from 1945 to 1947, he investigated war crimes and attended trials of war criminals. He was a qualified lawyer. He came to know as much as anyone about the crimes committed by the Nazis. This is not the only part of his wartime, this is the only part of his wartime experience about which he would not talk. The facts were too chilling for them to leave his lips, at least while talking to his children. There are hints in correspondence conducted with his wife. Many of his contemporaries kept all their memories of this period to themselves. He was in the habit of quoting one of his teachers who told him, quotes, "The most important thing is the question man has put to himself when he raises his eyes to heaven. What is my duty in this world? Every morning, before you begin your day, ask yourself this question. Do not try to answer it. There is no short answer to it. It will not come to you quickly. Maybe it will never come to you. It happens not. It matters not. The thing is to realize that the question is important, that you have a duty to perform and you have to search for it." He regarded his duty as forming a bridge between the Poles and the Jews. He helped in setting up the Institute of Polish Jewish Studies in Oxford. He sat on the board of editors for the Library of Holocaust Testimonies. Each year he opened the Jewish Festival in Krakow, where he helped establish the Foundation for Jewish Culture. That's culture as opposed to religion, I should say, in a disused synagogue, where the curator can't bring himself to this day to remove his name from his office. He helped start the Jewish Quarterly and stayed on the editorial board. I attended a meeting in Krakow to celebrate its alumni and was told by a young Pole that my father was a legend. His claim to fame and position of authority in that setting was the depth of his knowledge and his care when apportioning blame, especially to the Poles. As he always said, the British were saved from having to find out whether they would have behaved any differently. I find the exhibition at Auschwitz dedicated to the Nazi treatment of the Poles one of the most distressing. He would never say that he forgave the Germans for their crimes or the Poles for their anti-Semitism, saying that is the work of God, a case of dissimulation for an atheist that he was. He had become a sort of one-man commission of truth and reconciliation. He claimed he had not lived one day in Poland without suffering from anti-Semitism and had no experience of anti-Semitism during his 65 years living in Britain. Given that he was not stupid or living as a hermit, he was clearly holding a different view of what constituted anti-Semitism to that being used today. For life in Poland, anti-Semitism was both institutionalized in rules and regulations, but also coursing through the blood of more than a minority of Poles with whom he shared the same streets, cafes and shops. He felt that what he experienced in England was in a different category that could be ignored or overcome. Ospicin, it's Yiddish for Oswiecim, which is Polish for Auschwitz, which is the German name of the camp, is the family home of the Scharfs. My great-great-grandfather, Moshe Yaakov Scharf, was rabbi of the Great Synagogue of Ospicin up to 1869. There are very many Scharfs buried in the town cemetery, and very many whose remains will never be found, having been walked to their death camp down the road. In 1995, my father was invited to a conference being held at Auschwitz-Birkenau to discuss how it could be conserved and interpreted to visitors from Poland and from around the world, having been designated a World Heritage Site in 1979. His obsession with the foundation of Jewish culture in Krakow lasted right up to the last days of his life. But the last time I remember of his engagement with Auschwitz was when we discussed the coincidence that his visit to the death camp had occurred at the same time as my first visit to the former RAF Upper Heyford, that had been equipped by the US to participate in nuclear holocaust. He had no hesitation in agreeing that such sites should rightly be called Holocaust sites. He ended his last public lecture by saying, "How will human beings face up to the evil they are capable of perpetrating? How will they renew their faith in morality in a world of which, in Adorno's words, we cannot be too much afraid, and which contains instruments of destruction that put even the gas chambers in the shade? And the answers to such questions hang all our tomorrows." Barely a day has passed since 1995 that I have not been engaged in a campaign to prevent inappropriate physical changes or uses being made of the Cold War remains at Upper Heyford. The Oxford Trust for Contemporary History was set up to front that campaign and promote the use of the site as an instructional monument, the label given to it by Martin Bell, and to improve understanding of the Cold War, why and when it started, and why it has continued. This use of heritage would hopefully improve the understanding of the present, in particular relations with Russia. However, the government's current policy of retain and explain, that has been amplified by the attacks on some of our cultural artifacts, sculptures and names, is not being applied to what is regarded, despite some unfortunate developments, as the best preserved site from the Cold War. While embroiled in the handling of a current application for a master plan at Upper Heyford, having previously appeared at 5 public inquiries, I'm now expanding a master's dissertation, Who Cares About the Cold War, using the former RAF Upper Heyford as a touchstone into the length of a book. Relations with the current owners have turned sour, mainly about an attempt to have the site included on the tentative list of World Heritage Site status. Paul Silver, who is effectively the owner, refuses to explain the hostility. So I'm left guessing that in trying to sell houses, he does not want to draw attention to the former nuclear capability of the site, or increase the tourist traffic that might limit capacity for his housing and employment growth. He is also a person of Jewish heritage and uneasy about the use of the site for the path of madness, that's mutually assured destructiveness, that takes place on Holocaust Memorial Day every year. He does not share my father's belief that Holocaust is an appropriate label for the site, or that it is relevant that the Jews have a special day dedicated to Holocaust memory, that's Yom HaShoah. That was April the 27th this year. It goes by the lunar calendar. He seems to think that drawing parallels between atrocities diminish their significance. The picture reproduced in the Abingdon Peace Group newsletter those of you who've seen a copy, shows my mother walking the path of madness, which is the NATO runway at Upper Heyford. When she died, her MP, Andrew Dismore, wrote to say how much he had appreciated the stream of letters sent by her as chair of the branch of the United Nations Association that caused him to look at and over the horizon, rather than at some local injustices. I've no reliable timeline or further communication with Mr. Dismore to shine a light on the fact that it was on his initiative in 2001 that 27th of January was designated Holocaust Memorial Day. Father, mother, and now son seem to be on the same page, that Holocaust Memorial Day is to reflect on crimes against humanity wherever and whenever they occur. When sending out the notice of the Path of Madness, I can't avoid a sense that Jews and the HMD Trust feel that this is more about the Shoah. My father always used that term, and on other genocides, so I'm careful to include Jews to have their and my family's Jewish story included. However, today is important to reflect on less known about Holocausts, possibly more so, as they illustrate the emptiness in the slogan, "Never Again." In recent years, people have referred to climate change as mutually assured destruction. That seems to be very opposite, and to a sixth mass extinction. Finally, a reminder that this year, on the 30th of January, at 11 AM, the Path of Madness will start with a service at the control tower at Greenham Common, another Holocaust site, followed by a walk to the cruise missile silos, which is separated by a security fence, and then to the Peace Garden, created in memory of the Greenham women. So thank you for listening. I'm very grateful to share the platform with Rebecca, who will talk about other Holocausts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for all that you said there. Could you just repeat the date that the Greenham event is happening?
It's the closest Sunday to the 27th, so it's the 30th of January. It's not advisable to try to get there by public transport, unfortunately. But it's 11 o'clock at the control tower,
Right,
which has now been restored with toilets and cafe.
thank you very much. Before we move to Rebecca, is there anything immediately that anyone would like to ask Daniel factually, or before we move to Rebecca? There'll be time after Rebecca to ask general questions of any aspect of what Daniel has said and what Rebecca will say. If there isn't, I'll pass to Rebecca, and you're very, very welcome, Rebecca. And we look forward very much to hearing and seeing your presentation, as I gather you have a PowerPoint also.
Hello, everybody. If you'll bear with me, I'm trying to get to the bit where I can share this. Can you see can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, it's very, very difficult to follow Daniel. I reflect on something I remember feeling as a child when I was told about the Holocaust, an anger, and I was just convinced that the people who were responsible for this must have been very stupid. But my mother soon disabused me of this and told me that the Germans were perhaps the most educated and cultured people in the world at the time, and that 2/3 of the people at the Wannsee conference who decided the fate of the Jews, 2/3 of them had PhDs. So I was reminded of that in 2004 on my first visit to Rwanda, when I went to a prison and I met some of the masterminds of the genocide there. And I ended up talking to a guy who had been a professor of English at the University of Butare in Rwanda. And it turned out that he was very keen on Jane Austen, and we both liked Pride and Prejudice more than any other of her novels, you are probably getting a taste for how surreal this conversation was. This guy was, freely admitted that he had killed more than 100 Tutsi himself and was one of the masterminds. And when I asked him if he had any regrets, because there he was, no longer a professor at the university, and he said to me, yeah, I really regret we didn't get them all, but we will next time. Which deals, I think, rather well with the idea that we comfort ourselves with, that somehow we are different from the people who commit genocide. Now, I'm showing you, Rwanda is known for two things, the genocide and this fine fellow here, a mountain gorilla. So I'm going to summarize my conclusions about genocide now, because I'm bound to run out of time. First of all, I think that the problem for the international community is that we do not recognize that genocide and the capacity to commit genocide is part of human nature. We pretend it's an aberration, and therefore we don't have early warning systems. If we instead recognize that this is part of what it is to be human, that we're capable of awfully good things and really horrible things, then we might be better at dealing with the predictable fact that genocide is going to happen. I remember a Rwandan saying to me, don't tell me you're a good person. You're just a person who has not yet been tested by life. We have all of these conventions and international law on human rights, and we comfort ourselves that this is somehow going to stop genocide happening again, but it doesn't, because we have no mechanism to actually enforce any of those laws and conventions. We send peacekeepers into conflict zones, but we don't actually give them a Chapter 7 mandate to protect civilians. So what are we actually doing? We're making ourselves feel better, and we're avoiding the fact that most of these genocides are because of political reasons that require political solutions, not military solutions, because we know how futile that is, and also not just humanitarian solutions. It is so easy to think, as you know, I spend so much time writing parliamentary questions to try to get British ministers to act on the various horrors happening around the world. And you can kind of, they must have a team of monkeys sitting at typewriters, at computers, churning out the same old response. Her Majesty's government is very concerned. We're sending this much aid. And I'm reminded of something that a young woman in Darfur told me in 2004. She said, it's very kind of you to send the humanitarian aid and the blankets, but we're Africans. We're pretty good at coping with not much. What we'd actually like is if you would take the guns away from the people who are killing us. But here's the thing, we're not going to do that, because we would rather tinker around the edges rather than confronting the fact that the international community needs to concentrate on political solutions. The other thing we need to do is make our sanctions personal to the architects of genocide, and we never do this. And again, I had one of those aha moments when I was confronted by the Sudanese ambassador to London, and he didn't care at all about the horror stories I told about Sudan. But when I suggested that we should actually personally sanction the people responsible, the architects of the genocide, by, for instance, stopping their shopping trips to Paris, or their money laundering trips to London, or their medical trips to Switzerland, he went berserk. And that was for me a moment of enlightenment, that we should actually make it personal to these people rather than their populations, because that is so often futile. So here are the two bits of that are relevant. And the word that matters on the 1948 Genocide Convention is the word intent, because it is very, very hard to show the intention to destroy. The other thing that strikes me about that definition is that it doesn't include social class, and it should, because Cambodia was a mass killing that was about social class. And so was Bosnia. Nobody likes to talk about this, but the Bosnian Muslims were the city living, sophisticated, cultured people. And the Serbs resented them. And in the case of Rwanda, the Tutsi were known as the Jews of Africa. They tended to be more entrepreneurial and better educated. So I really think that social class should be in there. The point about the Treaty of Westphalia is that whatever one may feel about international conventions and human rights laws, as far as I can see, the Treaty of Westphalia is the one that is still the dominant piece of law. And I'll mention that again when we get to the people who are on the United Nations Security Council. So here are the factors that should alert us to the fact genocide's going to happen. When you have political leaders who are too incompetent or too lazy to confront the economic problems in their country, guess what? They find scapegoats and they try to blame others and stir up residual racism. Think of the ones in our own time. Slobodan Milosevic, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary, Bashir in Sudan, Putin, a master of diversion, rather than actually knuckling down and sorting out his basket case of an economy in Russia, and Habyarimana in Rwanda. What do? They manipulate their populations, they exploit their feelings of fear, that if we don't kill those Bosnian Muslims, they're going to come and rape your daughter. If we don't kill those Tutsi, they're going to take over our country. The other thing that is noteworthy is the intellectual justification, bringing in academics to say, we need greater Serbia, or we need greater Germany. Germans need living space. And too often academics have been prepared to add their names to the horror that is done in their name. Muslims from Islamic State killing the Yazidis in Iraq, where I went a few years ago with my charity to do training, psychotherapy training with the Yazidi. The Muslims were told, and the Islamic State guys were told that they were actually fulfilling a religious duty to rape the women and girls. They felt the hand of destiny on their shoulders because they had leaders who told them that. Greed. I have interviewed people in Rwanda who killed their neighbor for a cooking pot. Serbs, during the Bosnian War, thousands of them would rent a car or a truck over the weekend, go into Bosnia over the mountains, and loot and rape and come home on Sunday night with a new refrigerator or whatever. Honey, I'm home. Look what I brought you. Nice new microwave. And lest we forget that in most German cities throughout the Second World War, there were auctions of the possessions of Jewish citizens. So how could anybody pretend that they did not know what was happening? And incidentally, also, let's remember the number of people who betrayed their Jewish neighbors so that they could get their jobs and promotion. Finally, conformity is part of the human makeup. That is what really makes us such interesting critters, isn't it? That we are capable of good and evil. When I talk about conformity, you're an educated audience, so you will know about Stanley Milgram's his experiments in getting students to electrocute each other. And you probably also know about Philip Zimbardo's experiments this is back in the 60s, of setting one group of students against the other. And he had to stop the experiment very rapidly because people were behaving so incredibly badly. If you don't know about those two experiments, they tell you everything you really want to know about human nature. You will be familiar with these signposts, all of which appear in just about every one of the mass killings that I'm going to show you a list of. The last one disturbs me. Black African lives don't matter. They don't matter largely to white diplomats, but they also don't matter to the Black African elite. It is worth remembering that only one African spoke up about the Rwandan genocide, and I bet you could already guess who that was. It was Nelson Mandela. Everyone else was mute on the subject because they didn't want the finger of blame one day pointed at them. Unfortunately, Arab lives don't appear to matter to the elites running Arab countries. Otherwise, why would they be so keen to distract their populations every time they ask for freedom, justice, transparency, and accountability by going on about Palestine? Do we really believe that Palestine would still be the situation it was if the Arab world was actually serious about caring? They're not. Do we actually think that the Uyghurs would be in this situation in China, or the Rohingya, or the Kurds? Again, if the Arab elite running Muslim majority countries cared about their fellow Arabs, this is, or Muslims, this is a horrible part of human nature. Now, here is the perfect victim. For the benefit of the people joining from Toronto, it's a little girl. This is a little girl who was kidnapped or disappeared. And the British media have been obsessed with her ever since. Doesn't matter how many other people have disappeared, even on the same day. This is the perfect victim. This is what they would, much rather talk about, rather than 5 million people who've died in the Congo since 1994. This is a list of mass killings. I'm sure I've missed some off. Unfortunately, the word at the bottom fell off my PowerPoint. It's Yazidi. And as I said, these don't all fall into the category of the 1948 Genocide Convention, but they are mass killings, and they are all examples of the international community looking away because it would take too much effort to find political solutions, and they don't particularly want to waste, as they would see it, their political capital. So let's go to Sudan, which is the large orange country in the sort of northeast section there. This is an old map of Sudan because I'm talking about what happened before South Sudan was created in 2011. The Nile runs down north-south on the right-hand side of your picture. The tribes along the Nile self-identify as Arabs, and for hundreds and hundreds of years, they have enslaved the Black population in the south of the country and in the west of the country in Darfur. And they also cite passages of the Quran that justify slavery. The other added ingredient to that genocide is that the Sahara is moving south at quite a rate, and therefore it was pushing self-identified Arabs off their land. And the government, rather than trying to sort out that problem with a political solution, said, well, armed them and told them to go and kill the Black Africans in Darfur and take their land, which they did. And this started in about 2003. Although, as I say, there's a background here of, centuries of abuse of the Black Africans. The Black Africans in Darfur, incidentally, are Muslim, but they're the wrong kind of Muslim as far as the self-identifying Arab tribes are concerned. And I use the word self-identifying because there's a lot of intermarriage, but what matters is how you identify yourself. With the help of local Arab tribes whom they armed, the government of Sudan launched a campaign of ethnic cleansing using bombing and raids on villages. An unknown number of people were killed and continue to die because this has not stopped. This has continued. The government of Sudan always said, oh, no, it's not a genocide. These are ancient ethnic hatreds. And, you can't say that any Black Africans are being targeted. And yet it was only Black African villagers who were destroyed. Some of you are familiar with the following drawings that were drawn by children in a refugee camp in Chad, whom my organization Waging Peace met. And we asked them to draw us pictures about their lives. We didn't suggest anything else to them. Now, the reason I show you this is look at the way the children draw the victims themselves, the color of their skin, and look at the color of the skin they see and the self-identified Arabs killing them. And this gives the lie to the widely accepted line from the government in Khartoum that it wasn't a genocide. It was, vastly overstated. It was just a bit of violence. Look at the color of the skin. You or I would not have been able to distinguish a self-identified Arab from a self-identified Black African, but they surely can. And the point of this, of me showing you this drawing, is the bottom right-hand side. Those are Black African Darfuri women being chained by the neck and led off to planes to take them back to Khartoum, where they were distributed among government soldiers and generals and officers as slaves, and they haven't been seen since. And as I said, this continues to this day. There was a blip of hope in 2019 when citizens took to the streets and overthrew Bashir and his Islamist dictatorship. But unfortunately, the army and the Islamists have fought back. And even as we speak, people are being killed on the streets of Khartoum and once more in Darfur. Unfortunately, the army had too much to lose because a lot of the Islamists have full control of the economy. And the last thing they're going to do is allow civilians to demand accountability. To my mind, Sudan is a worse country than Iran. We hear an awful lot about how terrible and repressive Iran is. But of course, the international community has it in for Iran because the paymasters in Saudi Arabia have it in for Iran, whereas Saudi Arabia has always supported the Islamists and the generals in Sudan. This is a country where on an average year in Khartoum, 40,000 women will be beaten in the streets by soldiers for indecency, and that means wearing jeans. They'll still be in full hijab, but they might show a bit of ankle. And this is actually a technique used to stop women and girls going to school and getting education. They say you're indecent, and literally 40,000 a year are beaten in the streets. It also has one of the highest levels of female genital mutilation. They persecute Christians. It's a country where the UK habitually, all through this awful period, starting in 2003, it expressed its concern, and yet the United Kingdom was training their security services. I will move on to Rwanda because I don't have much time. Here we have a situation, a bizarre situation. Originally a German colony, the Treaty of Versailles was handed to the Belgians. The Belgians decided to make the Tutsi, who were only 12% of the population, to put them in charge because they regarded them as the educated and entrepreneurial minority elite. And that continued until just before independence in 1960, when the Belgians suddenly decided it wasn't a good idea to have the minority in charge. So they put the majority Hutu in charge. And the Hutu had decades of resentment against the Tutsis. So from 1956 onwards, they started slaughtering the Tutsi. And we most famously know about the genocide of 1994, where an estimated 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutu were slaughtered in only 100 days in one of the most economically successful genocides ever, because they just used bullets and machetes. Incidentally, that's a picture of a checkpoint. The checkpoints were thrown up around the country on April the 6th, 1994, and they stopped anyone going through, and if they had an identity card that identified them as a Tutsi, they were slaughtered on the spot. I've spoken to dozens of people who survived by pretending to be dead and lying there like that, some of them for 2 or 3 days and nights, pretending to be dead. And I'm talking about people who were 8 years old at the time. And it still blows my mind to think about a child of 8 having the wisdom to know to lie there. Some of them with their parents bleeding to death on top of them. I could spend really the next 2 hours talking about what happened in Rwanda. But suffice to say that, as with Sudan, the international community, first of all, denied it was a genocide, denied that there was genocidal intent. Famously, Bill Clinton said, these are acts of genocide that are happening, but it's not actually genocide. And of course, in the case of Sudan, Colin Powell, may he rest in peace, told the United Nations, oh yeah, genocide is happening in Darfur, but that doesn't mean we have to do anything about it. So here we have a denial of the scale of what was happening, and as ever, a willingness to send aid rather than actually getting to grips with the politics of this. Here's why genocide does keep happening. All the people there on the Security Council, they all manufacture weapons, and they have a great financial interest in selling those weapons rather than preventing genocide. You may have your own views on that, of course, but it's also not valuing the lives of people who have no particular interest to them. I would argue that the rules of the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia are what actually dominate. None of these countries want to have a spotlight shone on their own behavior. Russia doesn't want you to look at how it's treated the Chechens, for instance. China certainly doesn't want the world to start looking at how it treats the Uyghurs or people in Tibet. France was so involved in the Rwandan genocide, supporting the Hutu all along, right from the beginning, training the Hutu who committed the killing, supplying the weapons to the Hutu every night during the genocide. For 100 days, a plane would arrive from France, an unmarked plane carrying weapons. I've interviewed people in Rwanda who were captured by the French soldiers who were there ostensibly as peacekeepers, taken to camps and raped all the time. The French were involved in luring Tutsi out of hiding so that the Hutu could then slaughter them. And bizarrely, the reason France was always on the side of the Hutu was that the Hutu traditionally spoke French as a second language and looked to France, whereas the Tutsi spoke English as a second language and looked to Great Britain. And France, following the humiliation of the Second World War, was intent on keeping as many zones of influence in the world as possible. And if that meant backing the Hutu so that Rwanda did not move into the Anglophone sphere of influence, then so be it. Mitterrand once said, France is the great hen followed by the little black chicks. And he was referring to Francophonie. And as you know, the UK has its own sordid history, most recently, of course, as money butler to any oligarch who wants their funds, their ill-gotten gains, cleansed. I'm going to leave you on a more positive note. As I said, I could talk about Sudan and Rwanda for the rest of the evening, but I'm going to leave you with this positive image here. This is the work of Network for Africa. We train survivors of genocide in Rwanda, Uganda, and Sierra Leone to be psychotherapists. This is a group of survivors who are doing talk therapy. So far, we've reached about 11,000 former child soldiers in Uganda and many, many hundreds of people in Rwanda, Uganda, and Sierra Leone. This is as high tech as we get. We give them the training and give them a bicycle so they can go off to remote villages to do weekly group therapy sessions. It does not need highly paid white people in four-wheel drives going around doing this. You just, these people are not stupid. A lot of them may not have gone to school for very long, but that doesn't mean they're stupid. They usually know what is required, if only we had the humility to listen to them. And finally, meet Simon, a little boy at one of the schools that we started. And I'm pleased to say that this year, this is in Rwanda, this year, this little boy's school took home several trophies from the International Spelling Bee competition. And I'm incredibly proud of that. Thank you very much for listening. I know I've gone over my time and I apologize for that.
We're deeply grateful, Rebecca, for that presentation. It leaves one aghast. It does me anyway. Yeah. I'm glad you ended on some sort of hope, because as we went through, it became more and more difficult to find a sense of hope. But with your work for Network for Africa, that stands in sharp contrast to the lack of success of getting the British government to take any action whatsoever, which you have spent obviously so much time and energy on trying to raise awareness and to move the government to act politically rather than, as you say, merely send humanitarian aid. Can I open it up to anyone to comment or ask questions, or Rebecca or Daniel?
How do you want it? Raise hand?
Yes, raise hands would be good. Michael.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for both your presentations. This is something I've thought about a lot. My mother was a Jewish refugee from the Nazi Holocaust. She came over as a teenager in 1937. And so it's something I've thought about a lot. And I would like to add another dimension to the causes of genocide. And that is something I would term spiritual identity in its widest sense. And I don't necessarily mean connected with religion as such. And what I've noticed, looking at the various cases which Rebecca has mentioned, is if you look at the perpetrators, they have somehow lost their sense of spiritual direction. It has been stated that one of the causes of the Nazi Holocaust was the humiliation in the Treaty of Versailles. And if you go back further than that, you get the unification of Germany, and it was a country that was still finding its feet. It had two different religions, Protestantism and Catholicism. And so by the 30s, the country was at a very low ebb spiritually, and what it saw in the Jews were people who were at a very high level of spiritual identity. I mean, the idea of the chosen people is mentioned a lot. Now, that may is one thing to the Jews, that they have to be, they have to follow various commandments and so on. But what the Germans saw was people with a closeness to God, to the spiritual dimension, whatever that meant, and that acted as a threat. It was a kind of blockage to the Germans to actually resolve their own sense of spiritual identity. They were kind of in the way. If you imagine them at the bottom, the Jews in the middle, and sort of God at the top, that was their perception. And they had to kind of remove this blockage in order to re-establish their sense of identity and their sense of humanity. And that is actually what happened, because now Germany is a democracy and it has recognized this stage that it went through. And if we look at other genocides, for instance, the Armenians in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing. They had, after many centuries, that had lost its sense of direction. It had lost the war. It was described as the sick man of Europe. And again, they saw the Armenians as having a very strong sense of religious identity, and it was the same with Biafra and the Igbos, I think, although these are not things I've studied. And you mentioned Islamic countries a lot. I would just say one thing I feel about Islam is the way that when they commit the atrocities, these Islamists, they say Allahu Akbar, God is great. Now look at the corollary of that. If God is great, they are small, they are insignificant, they don't have that sense of spiritual identity and a direct path to God. They are subject. It's inshallah, if Allah wills it. And I don't see that as having a strong spiritual connection with the divine world. So there again,
Mike, that's good. Could we ask Rebecca or
yes,
Daniel to comment on?
Sorry, yes, I think I've made my point. I hope you all understand what I mean.
Thank you, Michael, very much. Rebecca, or Daniel, would you like to respond to Michael?
Really interesting point, in which case we should all be very worried about Russia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'd be just a little bit surprised if my father's community, and it was a very strong community in Kazimierz. There were lots of synagogues, it's true. And he was probably one of the least religious families, so it could have been regarded as spiritual from the outside, but I would put community above religion. They were very close, and they spread through the city. A third of Krakow was occupied by Jews, and lots of the businesses, the market square was full of Jewish businesses. So they're very, very conspicuous and integrated in many ways. But it's funny, I've never heard the word spiritual attached to it, but very much, very community.
I'm talking about how the perpetrators perceive the victims as a as one of your pre-indicators of genocide that Rebecca mentioned. You know, in its widest sense. I'm not sort of necessarily talking about particular cases.
It's very true that the Poles were and are, I think, anti-Semitic, but they didn't perpetrate genocide. It was the Germans that came in and could quite well have perceived it as you do. But the Poles were very spiritual and very anti-Semitic at the same time.
Well, it's the same thing. Look at Polish history, how they've been sandwiched between Russia in the east and Germany in the west. I mean, again, they've been struggling to find their own identity for centuries. You see, this is a common factor that I've picked up. You may disagree, but that's what I believe.
Thank you, Mike. Sean, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Rebecca and Daniel, for both of your talks. It was really interesting. One thing that got me thinking was that both of your talks seem to have the link that it's about taking the survivors' testimony to change or to influence the narrative of the situation they're within. I was just wondering how you both thought we could tackle that on, I guess, an international, national, or even a local scale.
I'm not sure what you're getting at. Sorry, can you explain, Sean?
So when you're talking about, using in Rwanda, the gang survivors to be the psychotherapy, to use them to influence what's going on, and then Daniel talking about how your father was obviously involved in things going on. That to me gives the link of using people that have been involved to influence, the situation or the genocide or whatever narrative it's in. So I was just wondering how you think, for example, on say on an international level, how could we expand that?
I think the only thing I would draw is that there's some very powerful, but not powerful enough, Jewish voices against the treatment of the Palestinians. And when I say not powerful enough, there are more and better connected Jewish voices supporting the Zionist state. So yes, there are Jews who are Jews for Palestine, who are Jews for justice, but ineffective. But I don't deny, and I wish them well, and I know them, but they're not sufficient.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that most of the diplomats and politicians I speak to are so hardened and have heard so much testimony from survivors that it just goes past them. And therefore, I take a rather more cynical view that like I said, we have to make this personal. We have to name and shame our own politicians who prioritize trade deals over the human rights that they maintain they care about so much. It's just verbiage. It's just sanctimonious verbiage. And I think that we have to devise ways of providing benchmarks by which we measure countries that are abusing human rights. And we have to, find some way, and it's probably, that's why I talk about personal sanctions, smart targeted sanctions that actually, make the financial everyday life of the perpetrators of genocide difficult and humiliate them. There's nothing as humiliating as having your American Express card refused by a merchant if you are one of these fat cats. They care an awful lot more about their status than they do about the story of someone being raped in Darfur. That is, in my experience, that is just leaves them cold. They've heard it all before. So we need to be naming and shaming our own people and holding them to account for, their promises of how they care about human rights. And at the same time, we have to be pushing them to apply targeted smart sanctions on the perpetrators.
Rebecca, do you feel any movement forward on that in the smallest or larger way?
Not in Britain, unfortunately. I think that President Biden is a big improvement on the previous regime in Washington. However short-lived Biden's presidency and the Democrats in power may be, they, at least they're moving in the right direction. Although clearly they meet resistance from the Europeans, and particularly the British, who, as I say, prioritize trade. I kind of daydream about, rather than the UN Security Council, of whom I despair, I daydream about a coalition of the willing, of democracies that do appear to value human rights. And I'm talking about the Scandinavians and, New Zealand, Canada, the Germans, and the French to some extent, that they might be persuaded to together apply strict economic sanctions on individuals. I think that's probably the way forward.
Thank you. Mike, Mike and then Nigel. Oh, you're muted.
I've unmuted myself. Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with anything that Rebecca or Daniel have said at all. I think it's absolutely right. But Rebecca just now say, we have to do this, and she used the pronoun we several times. But I think that's where some of the answer lies, and that needs a bit more stressing. We are the grassroots movement, and we might be pitifully small, or seem to. Of course, the regime always wants us to think we're insignificant and small, but the regimes are always scared of opposition. Look how scared they ran in the run-up to the Iraq invasion in 2003. So it's a long shot, but we have to start a self-education movement amongst ordinary people, whereby we don't allow ourselves to be recruited to this vicious nonsense of race hate and hate of groups that are selected for us to hate. So that's really what I have to say. I think we mustn't forget we have to work on the grassroots. It's hard because it's one person at a time, really. That's what I have to say, really.
Well, I'm a veteran of the anti-apartheid movement, and I agree with you completely. You know, if it hadn't been for people like us over decades shining a light on the horrors of apartheid, goodness knows what would have happened. But I think to get back to Sean's point, it is our job as well to amplify the voices of people who are not being heard, who are the survivors and the victims in these places. And that's why the testimony is so important, and those children's drawings. And incidentally, I wanted to thank you so much for displaying those drawings, because they will always speak so much louder than words.
Yeah,
I absolutely agree with Sean's point. It doesn't contradict what I said.
Nigel.
Thank you. Yes, very, very interesting. Thank you. One thing I'd say, I'm not quite so sure about the role of spirituality in this. I think it's very small, really. I wanted to ask Rebecca, really, some of these things look quite self-contained in certain countries and so on, but I feel there is quite sometimes an outside influence. We have an influence, you know, people like ourselves, to try and highlight these things. But on the other side, there's it's sometimes these things aren't quite so self-contained in a country. I'm thinking of Rwanda, and I feel the French had a rather dirty part to play there. And I didn't know if you could sort of comment on things like that, because it wasn't just what happened in Rwanda. I think the French had some very nasty parts in that, for example.
Yes, indeed. As I mentioned, you know, the French still deny their role in Rwanda, but there was something called Operation Turquoise, which started in about 1990, which was, you know, aimed at maintaining the Hutu hegemony there at whatever cost. And, you know, they are still to this day, the French are denying their role in there. You know, you know, which takes us to Cameroon, where, you know, the French refuse. Yeah, you know what's happening in Cameroon, and that whole French influence throughout their former colonies. But yeah, that's why the Treaty of Westphalia is still so dominant, because, you know, people like to pretend that we are just taking care of an internal problem. And so you'll get the Cameroonian government saying this is an internal problem, it's none of your business. But you can see all across the Sahel, you know, it's partly climate change. It is partly to go to Michael's point about spiritual identity. A lot of unemployed young Muslim men who need some kind of identity, a sense of belonging. And unfortunately, Islamist terrorists come along, and it's a lot more attractive to ride around in a Jeep with a gun and a pair of dark glasses than it is to be working in a boiling hot field. And they can attract a lot of these young men and they say to them, you know, this is your destiny. This is right across the Sahel, a whole belt of Africa where these terrible things are happening. You know, these young men are there to be manipulated, and we don't even begin, I feel, we don't even begin to recognize the danger of this. And we tinker around the edges, and you know, it needs a much broader look at that. And it also requires us to confront the Saudi Arabians who are bankrolling a good deal of this.
Yeah. Anyone else who would like to, Sally?
Yeah, Rebecca, looking at your slide of the pre-genocide factors, I don't know if you had written it deliberately so that it sounds like a description of present day UK, but it jolly well sounds like it to me. Are you at all worried that we might slide into genocide here? I mean, the police bill was pretty against the Romani travellers and was heading towards a possible genocide there. What do you think of that?
I certainly wouldn't use the word genocide, but you are entirely right that when I wrote that list, I was thinking of the diversionary tactics, the manipulation of voters. What was Brexit, if not, you know, the manipulation of people looking at their fears, looking for scapegoats, refusing to accept the economic problems that require serious thinking rather than gimmicks. I think I wouldn't use the word apathy, but I entirely agree that travelers and Roma are being targeted, but so are any immigrants, you know, any refugees. I mean, this outrageous idea of using the Royal Navy to turn back people. And I was delighted to see this morning that the Royal Navy is saying, nope, we don't want anything to do with this, because they understand that it would be against international law and they don't want to get involved in that. My fear, I have to say, Sally, is more the apathy of people in Britain rather than a slide towards genocide. It's apathy, indifference, and cynicism, all of which is stoked, unfortunately, by this current government, who seem to encourage people to think all politicians are bent. You know, there's no point, just, you know, go and watch the Great British Bake Off or something like that, rather than worrying yourself about this, rather than getting involved in civic society and trying to make changes. It's almost like they want us to not be interested. And that's incredibly worrying. And at its most extreme, you have the situation in the United States where Donald Trump or a Trump-like person may very well win the next election for exactly these same factors.
Nigel, we perhaps have time just for one or two more questions, but Nigel, you first.
Thank you. I wonder if you and Daniel could comment, just because we have a threatened Holocaust. We threaten other people with a Holocaust with our nuclear weapons that travel our roads. They go from our nuclear bomb factory, which is very near us, down at Burfield and Aldermaston. They go up to the submarines in Scotland. They pass Oxford and Abingdon fairly often. So I wondered if you could just think, could you just comment on that threatened Holocaust that the British government has perpetuated?
I'm going to hand this to Daniel because I really don't know enough about this subject.
I'm tempted to hand it back to Nigel. It's just my reading. There have been a number of accidents. In fact, you'd probably be more prone to blowing up the planet through an accidental misreading of something or a dropping of something from a plane by mistake than actually a deliberate Russia as Soviet US confrontation. I don't know what potential there is one of those Burfield bombs blowing up on its way through Oxfordshire. It doesn't worry me as much as what Rebecca's been talking about for the last half an hour, which actually scares me rigid, because it relies so much on human nature, and the people who have the power have human natures like she described at the beginning. They are manipulators, and they are psychopaths by any other name. And for some reason, coming back to the we, people on this screen, I'm not sure we don't aspire to power, we certainly don't have any. It seems that those who do aspire to it carry this baggage, which is very dangerous to humanity. So sorry, it's not an answer to your question, Nigel. I'm sure you know a lot about these transports, but they're not on my radar because there are other things, and it's mostly the human behaviour bit that's on my radar.
Oh, I agree. It's not just the transport. I'm thinking of the behaviour of the people who have their finger on the button. That's what I mean. They want to continue that, which is a great Holocaust threat to everybody.
Agree.
Do we have any final comment before?
I would just issue a final invitation to the service at the Greenham Control Tower on Sunday. And if you do come, bring something to read.
Perhaps we could, Sally, we could circulate the members as a follow-up, immediate follow-up to this meeting, just to give details of the event on the 30th. But it's certainly tonight, as a long-standing member of Abingdon Peace Group, it feels a very significant meeting tonight. It's brought a lot of things together. And what was in my, I remember the influence of Rebecca when she first came to speak to our group. And I think much has been said about power tonight, but I also think influence is of great significance, and we all have influence. And I just would like to thank Rebecca and Daniel very, very much indeed for their input tonight. And if there is anything that you feel that we as a group, as individuals with our own networks can do to further the work that you have given so much time and energy to, let us know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you all for inviting me. It's an honor to hang out with you, because you are doers, not just talkers. And I respect that.
Thank you very much indeed to all those who've come, and may we take up all that we've learned tonight and spread it in whatever ways we can, to create that grassroots, because in the abolition of slavery, as everything else that has been significant changes in history, it's a combination of where grassroots prepared soil meets the political, those who have political power and their self needs. So we need to work on the grassroots part of it. Thank you very much indeed for coming and sharing the meeting tonight. Thank you.
Bye.
Stay safe, everyone.
Everybody.
Thank you, Anne, for hosting it.